Okay. So welcome everybody. Welcome to the attendance. Welcome, of course, to our discussions that I will present in a few minutes. So we will be discussing today in the context of this AFD research conversation series about the relations, a very complex one indeed, between multilateral banks, development banks, and national development banks. And we will discuss that especially in the context of the SDG alignments, so-called SDG alignment, where don't shy away with all these concepts. We are going to specify all that and try to be as clear as possible on defining the scope of the discussions. Well, let me first start to present the author, the co-author of the paper with myself, Thomas Marois, who is there online. Welcome, Thomas. Very happy to have you here. So Thomas is a reader in development studies at SOAS University in London. He is a scholar of public banks in the global north and south, and the main author of an important book called Public Banks, Decarbonization, Definancialization, and Democratization, which is, of course, of very clear actuality indeed. And this was published by Cambridge University Press in 2021. Thomas is working very closely with various UN agencies on financing green transition, as well with COS and grassroots movements on all issues of public banking. And of course, he's also a good friend of Finance in Common Summit that we will mention later on. Elif TIMUR is also with us. Thank you, Elif, to take the time for this research conversation. She's the head of CB's Office of Evaluation since September 2020. So CB's is the Bank of the Council of Europe. Elif will specify that later on. Prior to this role, she had nearly 20 years of experience in development banking as country manager, in charge of social development operations in several CEB members countries. We also have with us Jean-Baptiste Jacouton. He's a researcher at AFD, and Jean-Baptiste is instrumental and devoted a lot of time to develop a research program and participation to the preparation of the next Finance in Common Summit that will take place soon in Colombia. We'll come back to that again. And I'm myself, Régis MARODON. So I'm working with the AFD also. I'm senior advisor there on sustainable finance issues. Prior to that, I contributed to development financing operations in many African, Mediterranean, and Latin America countries. I was successfully director for Turkey, Mexico, Latin America, and I'm now working with AFD's research department on sustainable finance issues. So before discussing with a more in-depth view on the paper from multi to national and back again, realizing the SDG potential of public development banks, I would like to give you, as an introduction, a few snapshots on public development banks. Who are they? What are they? What do they represent? They are usually quite unknown animals, and I think it's nice for the people who do not know them to have this sort of refreshment on public development banks. Well, first, when we started about 3-4 years ago now, investigations in that sector, it was clear that we were lacking a definition of these public development banks, because it's not all the public banking area. It's restricted to some institutions. So the question was that what exactly these development banks and public can be defined. We've selected 5 criteria to define them. The first one is that they should be a standalone entity. They should be a proper bank with balance sheet and its own profit and loss accounts. They should have a business model based on fund reflow seeking instruments, meaning that they don't rely only on budgetary resources. They also have to propose to customers some financial products and services. And the third criteria is that these funding sources should not rely only on public budgetary transfers, but should go beyond that, of course. The fourth criteria is that as development banks and as public banks, they should be very proactive in pursuing public policy mandates. And finally, they should be the government steering of corporate strategies that should fit into government priorities, which makes them also at the forefront of financings for government priorities. If you look at the landscape on that definition, well, surprisingly, you find that they are numerous. We've started a database with the University of Beijing a couple of years ago to try to identify all this universe of development banks. And as of today, we've identified 522 of them, 522. So it's quite a community indeed. They are present in 140 and 54 economies worldwide. And even more importantly, their total assets represent 23 trillion US dollars, 23 trillion. What figure would that be? It's a bit difficult to have a clear conception of such a big figure. So to illustrate it, one should think that this is roughly 10% of global financing assets of banking community in the world today. So it's major, really. When describing this universe, we see that it's very diverse, and whether you want to take them by size or by geographical origin or by shareholding structure or by mandate, you will get a very different set of banks here. Today, we are interested in particular with multilateral development banks. We count 55 of them. I mean, it's a bit counterintuitive because everybody knows the World Bank and the African Development Bank, these large regional banks, but multilateral banks are much more numerous, and there are many regions in the world that have arranged for having their own regional multilateral development banks. They totalize 2.3 trillion assets, so they are only 10% of the assets of the global community, which means that the vast majority of development banks are in fact national development banks. In our database, we count 356 of them, and so they are by far numerous. And so the question of the debate today is to see and investigate and try to understand better what is the interlink or the potential of connecting better this multilateral bank with the national development banks. So after this short presentation, I also want to mention to you that on the bottom of the screen, you have a question area where you can put your questions and we see them, and so we'll be able to address them. Avoid to put question in the chat because in the question area, you also have voting possibilities. And so when you like a question, you can also vote for it. And so it will attract more interest and probably the possibility also to answer the question. I would now like to turn to Thomas for a presentation of the paper we're discussing today. and its main contents and conclusions. So Thomas, if you please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Régis. It's a real great pleasure to be invited and to be here with you today, and particularly in a forum that's called a research conversation, because really this paper was about a fact-finding mission to have a better sense of what in fact, if any, are the relationships between multilateral development banks and national development banks, with the basic distinction being there that the multilateral development banks would be those banks that are owned and controlled by various governments at a national level, and multiple governments, and the national development banks being ones that are typically owned and controlled by national governments or some combination of national authorities and state-owned enterprises, to see what they're doing, because they really are, as Régis pointed out, a massive financial resource that is largely unknown and we could say untapped and remains untapped. So what I want to do today, over the next 10, 12 minutes, let's hope, is just sort of explain a little bit what the paper did in terms of our methods, what we found, and that'll be sort of the majority of the conversation today. And then discuss a bit why that's important throughout 4 of the main conclusions from the research that we did. And then conclude with some discussion of what's to be done, the 3-4 recommendations that come out of the study. Before that, I would just like to emphasize that this was a very nice project with AFD. It was a very nice collaboration with myself as a research, and we also worked with a graduate research student of mine, Jacob Stewart, who did a lot of the work for us and worked a lot with the surveys that were responded, and really collaborated with Régis in terms of thinking through the implications of the research, of the results that we found, and pitching that in a larger perspective of this really important question of how do we finance green and just transitions and really make use of the existing public financial resources that we have, and how can we catalyze that and maximize that for the public good. So in terms of the first part, what did we do? So it was a fact-finding mission. We reached out to 10 multilateral development banks. We ended up getting responses for a survey from 9 of the ones we reached out to. Those 9 included the African Development Bank, the Trade and Development Bank, and the Islamic Development Bank, all representative of the African and Middle East region. We had responses from the Development Bank of Latin America, CAV, and the Inter-American Development Bank, and they're representative of Central, South America, and Mexico. And then in terms of European region, the Council of Europe Development Bank, and Elif will speak to that. I'm very pleased to have her with us today. And the European Investment Bank responded to the survey as a European region. And then we had 2 respondents from the Asian region, the Asian Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So we had 9 responses overall from very significant banks representing 4 different regions. We gave them 13 questions, and it was done over the summer of 2022. So we're extremely grateful for our willing subjects to respond to us at that time, and because the 13 questions, it takes a significant amount of time, so we appreciate the input of the people working at these banks, and so let me publicly thank everyone for responding to the surveys. We then worked with the surveys and went through a process of data verification and triangulation, where we underwent a parallel process of reviewing the publicly available reports of the multilateral development banks, focusing on a 5-year period of 2017 to 2021. And then out of that, and in consultation with the survey question responses, then we went to a selection of national development banks and reviewed reports over a 3-year period, because there was many, many more of them, just to sort of test and triangulate and verify the various sorts of information and data that were received both from the surveys and from the multilateral reports in relation to the national development banks. So that's, in essence, the method by which we came to our results. So in terms of, what did we find from this process? And, first and foremost, I don't know if the results were surprising, but to have them sort of expressed concretely and to really have some meat behind them was really useful. And one of the first things that we found is that, yes, indeed, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there's lending between the multilaterals and national development banks in the regions, but very uneven. So within the European region, there was a significant amount of lending. There was identified in our research, 22, the MDBs are lending to 22 different, or have lent to 22 national development banks. And for in a 5-year period, for almost nearly 24 billion euros in resources flowing between. Latin America was second, with the MDBs lending to 15 different national development banks between 2017 and 2021 for around 8.2 billion in total financing between those entities. Asia, then we were only able to identify and find results for the top 5 national development banks that were being lent to for a total 1.75 billion euros. And then Africa and the Middle East came in terms of the ones we could find, the top 5 national development banks over that 5-year period for about 183 million. So significant differences in the regions, both in numbers and quantity of financing, and a fair amount of unevenness. We also found that in terms of the financing mechanism, that as expected, there are different ways of financing. And of the 9, 6 of the banks pointed toward all are engaged in non-concessional lending, meaning they're basically lending at market rates. But also a good number of the banks, 5, are giving it concessional or some sort of rebated or discount conditions. And then 4 of the 9 banks are also engaged in grants. And then they're also lending in terms of equity or financing in terms of equity and guarantees. So a fair amount of diversity in that as well. It was an important result, though, that came with this is that there are both financial services going on, but also there are non-financial services and interactions between the multilaterals and the national development banks. And I think this is maybe one of the most, as we'll relate as we go on, one of the more fruitful results or important bases upon which the future can and perhaps should be built. So what's the top sort of services we found that are provided by the multilaterals to the national development banks include project preparation, joint research projects, advisory services, and high-level meetings. And I think this is an important element in terms of knowledge exchange and capacity building, of which is going to be increasingly important as we push towards this question of how do we finance green and just transitions at the scale, rate, pace, and on the terms appropriate for that needed transition. The surveys came back with a range of beneficiaries of MDB financing to the national development banks. Like where are they channeling their money to? And pretty much hands down, the top beneficiaries were micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, followed by projects crafted around financial inclusion, extending financial access, but then also unsurprisingly, infrastructure being quite important there alongside industrial development. Particularly in the responses to the surveys, there was an interesting question in terms of asking the MDBs, what are some of the most promising aspects of your cooperation with the national development banks? And this, I just want to pull out a couple of things because I think it's quite important in relation to the green transitions. A number of the respondents said that some of the promising aspects were there, even if they weren't the most prominent presently, were their lending to municipalities, their prospects of lending to other local or regional authorities, gender-based finance in terms of promoting gender equality and empowerment, and similarly lending to local financial institutions. All of these being incredibly important for moving forward with green transitions and decarbonization and energy transition. So it's good that the MDBs are identifying these as promising aspects. We also found, and not surprisingly, there are barriers to cooperation between the MDBs and the NDBs. And it will vary significantly by the region. So the European banks, EIB and CEB, did not identify local currency or exchange rate risks as a barrier, of course, because they're dealing in the Eurozone. But for the CAF and the Islamic Inter-American Development Bank, local currency and exchange rate risks were a huge barrier to them effectively working or lending with national development banks, given the various currencies and exchange rates, creating different forms of risk and barriers to long-term effective cooperation. And other forms also came out of that in terms of the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, and the Trade and Development Bank in Africa, pointing to barriers in terms of different aspects of governance and governments, and as being and forms of politics being involved as being a barrier to their effectively working with the national development banks. Very interesting, and maybe Elif might speak to this. The CB came up with one barrier that I thought kind of spoke to the moment as well, as the World Bank is transitioning more to a sort of leveraging of private finance. The CB noted that there was a barrier in terms of contending operational models, insofar as the CB has an explicit social mission, working with certain European national development banks that were more focused on income generating projects. Created let's say, tension in mandates, and how do you sort of then align or work with different public banks at the multilateral national development banks that might have different mandates and different approaches to financing development. One being a more social mission, and the other one being geared more towards income generating projects. This then brought us to the second sort of major part of the survey, and that was to really understand what are the relationships between the MDBs and the national development banks in terms of the SDGs or sustainable finance, and what can we say about these public-public financial relationships in terms of sustainability. And this is really the challenge, and I think this is really the task that public banks, be they multilateral, national development banks, subnational development banks, public commercial banks, and so on. This is the challenge that they need to confront in terms of this green and just transition. How do you get the financing needed at the terms that are appropriate, at the right time, in the right place, at the right scale and pace needed for achieving substantively the UN 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It's a major challenge. How do we finance it all? How do we do it appropriately? And here, this is where a big gap, let's say, emerged. That in terms of us, as the community interested in financing green and just transitions, in terms of us charting out a concrete and viable pathway forward, there is significant room for improvement. Let's put it that way. That there are existing forms of sustainable climate finance between the multilateral development banks and national development banks, but there is a lot of room for improvement and advancement, and that in effect, there is certainly no universal alignment between MDBs, and sustainable development goals, and the national development banks in terms of aligning the lending and the programming and the existing both technical and financial cooperation they have. And bottom line is they're simply not aligned. Period. And so this is really one of the tasks that is before us. There is some promise. There are some, some of the NDBs, and this is all detailed in the reports, are providing some technical assistance, and there is some movement at the multilateral development bank level towards developing greater capacity in terms of aligning with SDGs. But at the same time, there's also great unevenness in terms of understanding the importance of the MDBs in terms of due diligence, ensuring that when they're lending to national development banks, is it their responsibility? Do they need to verify and take account of the funding going from NDBs to the national level, that they in fact reach an SDG and verifiable project, and so on. So there's a lot of work to do here. I think this will probably be part of much of our discussion today. So let me begin to wrap up here then. So this leads to four main conclusions from sort of analysis and our discussions and looking at the data overall. So the main conclusions that we came to as the authors is, first, yes, the MDBs are lending and mobilizing grants to national development banks, but that MDBs and NDBs have not formed an integrated global ecosystem of public financing. It simply does not exist yet. There might be pockets, but it's not integrated, not universal. And there was really a need then for more to be done to create a public ecosystem of catalytic and collaborative finance for green and just transitions. The second conclusion, and related to that, is that reporting on financial cooperation, simply in terms of detailing what is or what isn't going on between MDBs and NDBs, is also uneven. There's no standard commitments, and this has left us with a policy and accountability blind spot. Third conclusion, the multilateral development banks agree that there are multiple barriers to lending to NDBs, but this is really significantly context dependent. It will really vary on the region and the NDBs involved, so context matters. And the fourth, related to the SDGs, is that with few exceptions, there is no systematic alignment or tracking of SDG financing between the multilaterals and the national development banks globally. And then you could extend that the same conclusion likely applies between the national development banks and subnational lenders, to the extent it's probably a huge gap there as well in terms of SDG tracking. So what do we do? What's to be done? We have three and a half recommendations. So the first major recommendation, having reflected on these findings and gone back and forth in our research group and so on, is that the MDBs and NDBs need to co-develop. It's an important word here, co-develop another important word, a simple and standardized template or set of metrics capable of tracking existing financial cooperation. We need to be better informed. We need to know what's going on or what's not going on, but also not in hugely complicated matters. We need metrics that matter, that are co-developed in ways that will have impact and meaning and not overcomplicate the process, so we can really get a better view and then enhance that cooperation. Second recommendation is that the governing boards of the multilaterals, the NDBs, and the national development banks should demand that their public banks meaningfully and transparently report on and align with the 2030 SDGs. So again, and the wording here is important. The governing boards are the ones who ultimately own and control these institutions. It has to come down to that. The banks have to be given a mandate to do that in terms of, a mandate to track their public collaborations as a matter of policy. This is an important element, because what we want is for the public banks at the multilateral national level to really be setting what we call the global gold standard for green lending that is also socially just, and mobilize those enormous amounts of already existing public financial resources out there as a matter of policy rather than a matter of profit. And so then there's this big important discussion to be had. Why are we spending so much time in terms of the question of using public money to de-risk or deleverage private financing, which has all kinds of complications and may likely not the most effective use, where we can simply align trillions of dollars of existing resources as a matter of policy to get what needs to be done. The third recommendation then is that leaders, regulators, public bankers, and civil society need to then start thinking and acting according to a whole of public financial ecosystem approach. There are huge resources out there, huge amounts of knowledge and expertise, and that really needs to be reclaimed. And includes building up the capacity and recognizing the capacity in existing public financial institutions. So really about raising awareness and thinking more holistically about existing resources. The final, not formal recommendation, but by way of conclusion, and really as a catalyst for this research conversation here, is that what we need is more research on the existing barriers to enhanced multilateral development bank and national development cooperation, and about how to govern that. How do we create those mechanisms, create those interactions, and measure them in ways that are truly effective, accountable, and transparent, so we can make use of this already existing, public financial resources in a collaborative and transparent and useful way. So with that, I look forward to the conversation and happy to revisit any of the results we find or the recommendations as a jogging forward conversation. Thank you.
Many thanks, Thomas, for all these insights and indeed food for thoughts, which are quite striking in the present time. I want to remind to the audience that you have a question possibility. It's on the bottom right, where you can put your questions. We already have a few that are coming in. So do not hesitate to put more. You also have a voting button that you can use when you like a question in particular and you want to attract more attention to it. So please use these tools for that research conversation to be also yours, and that we have this nice interface. Before turning to Elif for having CEB's comment and her comment on what Thomas just extended. Thomas, there is a question I really am burning to ask you. We see these development banks around for so many years. I mean, if you look at the French Caisse des Dépôts, for instance, it was created 1 year after the Battle of Waterloo. So it was created in 1816 and it's still there. If you go by size, you will see that, for instance, the China Development Bank, created in 1994, is now having a balance sheet the size of French GDP, for instance. So, I mean, these are important old animals. They've been around for some time. They've been inspiring. If you look at the World Bank is now at the center of a discussion for becoming more green and be more transformational and be more active in the world. How do you explain that we know so little about them and that they've attracted so little? I mean, I think we can speak about a knowledge deficit here. What's your view on that, Thomas?
Thanks, Régis. That question keeps me up at night, but it also keeps me busy during the day. Let's put it that way. Yeah, you're right. There is an enormous knowledge deficit. There is, hardly any aspect or elements of public development banks, public banking that I think could not use more research. I think we've seen more articles and research and books in the last 5 years than had emerged, I would guess, in the previous 30 to 40 years. And to be frank about it, I think much of this has to do, and I'm going to put the blame on the World Bank. On the World Bank, they are a knowledge bank as much as they are a financing institution. And since the 1980s, the argument has been the private sector, whatever the problem is, private finance can resolve the challenges of the economy, of society, and increasingly of the environment. And so you can look at the reports and so on that come out of the World Bank. And so they're advocating privatization of state-owned banks. So why bother, researching a dead entity or something that's just going to be sold off? So there's very little motivation, and within the World Bank itself, it had never really provided any supporting information for that. And then at the same time, the research, I think, in academia were then much more in a defensive of, rather than looking and investigating public banks, multilateral, and particularly national development banks, there's a much greater deficit, and subnational public development banks. Instead of, looking at them soberly and thinking, what are they doing good? What are they doing bad? And how can we enhance and improve those institutions? It was more about defending them against, why aren't they making enough money? Why aren't they as profitable as private banks? Which is not their mission. It's not their mandate. So there was a big diversion, I would say, since the 1980s, and really, in response to the neoliberal sort of, push towards privatization. And that has had an impact in terms of just reducing the amount of scholars and programs that are interested in it. And on the other side, I think public banks themselves sort of were a bit defensive and not feeling that, that what they're contributing was really valued in society. So part of it is reclaiming the history of public banks, and public banks also projecting better what they do. And I've heard that from a lot of different public banks, that they're now at a point where they feel they should be prouder and stating more openly, and, we're doing an important thing. And we're not doing it on private bank terms. We're not doing it to maximize profit, but to maximize policy, to maximize social impact. And that is a very important message. And that is really the key of how we're going to confront the existential crisis of climate change and global warming. Sorry, I could go on and on forever on this, Régis.
No. We'll come back to that, because I think it's also one of the key for the future. But before that, maybe I turn to Elif now. And all the same, Elif, we're very pleased to hear your comments on that, and see how CEB, as a multilateral development bank, is seeing its relations with national development banks. You have a lot of experience on that, and I think it's interesting to have your views with the European focus, because we've been also seeing development banks also a lot as a tool for emerging economies, or for international support, or trans-borders financing. But at the same time, we see that in Europe, they've been there for a long time, and they play also a very important role, I think, in the economic development of all our European countries. So please, Elif, we're listening to you with great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you very much, Régis and Thomas, for this conversation, for organizing this event. I mean, I represent a bit the Multilateral Development Bank counterparty, because the Council of Europe Development Bank is actually the oldest multilateral development bank in Europe. Was founded in 1956. Initially, it was a fund for the post-World War II resettlement of refugees. It was founded by 8 member countries of the Council of Europe, which is the Strasbourg-based intergovernmental organization, and its mandate got revamped, with the opening of eastern widening of Europe, and basically in the 90s it was refocused on social cohesion at large in Europe, and the support to social development projects. So today there are 42 member countries. They include mostly EU member countries as well as EU neighborhood countries. In terms of sectors of intervention, the bank intervenes on health and social care, education, social housing, support to MSMEs, urban and rural development, microfinance, social and solidarity economy, as well as some areas of specific expertise of the Council of Europe, such as judicial facilities or cultural and historic heritage. And also, just to give you an idea in terms of total assets, in 22, they were in the range of 32 billion euros, the bank's total assets, with an average lending volume of about 4 billion euros. But the bank also increased that lending, for instance, during the COVID crisis. Typically in 2022, we got a 50% increase of disbursement and 40% in loan approvals. So we got 6 billion approved in 2022, half of which were COVID related. And also recently in 2022, it was, in the context of the war on Ukraine, where the bank had about a third of its lending volume to support member countries neighboring Ukraine, to support Ukrainian refugees. So coming to the borrowers, I mean, they can be sovereign loans, sub-sovereign loans, countries, governments, municipalities, regions, but also banks. And there we have the public banks, mostly the development banks, and the commercial banks, as well as cooperative banks and microfinance institutions. What's interesting is that national development banks have actually been important borrowers for the CEB. We've actually been channeling approximately 10 billion euros through national development banks since 2010. We had calculated more or less this amount in the context of our evaluation of CEB's engagement with national development banks. So that represents about 20% of CEB's overall lending over that period. So indeed, as the Office of Evaluation, we've recently been conducting an evaluation of the bank's engagement with those institutions. And for in-depth evaluation, we've selected 3 banks: Spain's ICO, which is the Spanish promotional bank, mostly focused on supporting MSMEs, but also other sectors; the Croatian Bank for Reconstruction and Development, HBOR, again supporting MSMEs, but also municipalities; and the Bulgarian Development Bank. And with the Bulgarian Development Bank, we again supported MSMEs, but also supported energy efficiency in the housing sector. So all in all, I mean, the national development banks are natural partners for the CEB. They are enabling us, to align CEB lending with national priorities, but also to join forces for mobilizing funds in the respective countries when it comes to crowding in the commercial banks. So that's also very important. For instance, in the sector of MSME lending, it's very important that national development banks are encouraging the financial sector to allow increased access to lending for instance, MSMEs that are smaller or, in remote areas and so on. And often national development banks cannot do that. They need the commercial banks, so they need to associate themselves either through Apex lending schemes or through risk sharing, co-financing, guarantees, to really direct that private sector financing where it's most needed and where there are difficulties of access. And the same applies for regional imbalances. Typically in certain countries, there are also very strong regional imbalances in terms of employment. So if we want to support the MSE sector for employment generation, we also have to make sure that it goes to that support goes to the right regions. And so that's why all that paper was extremely interesting to me. All the areas for reinforcing cooperation, and that's in line with also our evaluation conclusions. what's important is maybe to underline also that there are different roles. The banks are quite different. So in the case of CEB, a number of our countries, a very large number of our countries, have been in that transition period in the late 80s, early 90s. And there we saw that the national development banks were really playing an important role in this regard. So they were really there to support the economic transition from a centralized economy to a market economy. Whereas in other cases, like in the Western countries, they sometimes are more there to facilitate and orient lending towards the private sector, and there they have a very important catalytic role. It applies for big countries like France, Germany, where we've supported also many subnational development banks at the different federal state level. Also in the case of ECO in Spain, which actually is a bank that is working hand in hand with commercial banks and is actually very efficient and effective in this regard, and very appreciated by the commercial banks in Spain. So that's also has been part of our findings. Whereas in other countries, they also are more active in supporting municipalities. I mean, they also have different roles. In some countries, they have very specific, different institutions focused either on municipalities or the private sector, as that would require a very different type of expertise. So all in all, to say that, even in Europe, I mean, which is a more harmonious region, the picture is very diversified, and the national development banks that we've been supporting are also very, very different. So that's why I think all, the conclusions of the paper are very interesting, fully in agreement also with the recommendations. So I'll be happy we discuss them. And needless to say that the fourth recommendation for more research is self-evident. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elif, for your comments. Jean-Baptiste, I think we already have a few questions coming out from the chat that maybe you want to share with us and with our discussant today.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Régis. So, in fact, yes, this very interesting debate is raising already some questions. So, maybe a first one, which is really steering the public development bank ecosystem and its integration within the global financial architecture, is the question from Ephraim Garlando, who is asking, what is the role of the private sector? What is the role the private sector should play in the interplay between multilateral development banks and national development banks?
Okay, well, this is the very heart of the question here. Thomas, you want to take that?
Can I go second? Elif, would you mind taking that first? I'm still thinking a bit on it.
Okay, I mean,
yes.
It's true that it's true that's at the core of the role also of the multilateral development banks. But what maybe we should underline is that the multilateral development banks are themselves quite different. So typically, as CEB, we do have a social development role where we support both public and private sector projects, but for instance, in the case of the World Bank Group, that role of supporting the private sector is primarily also done through the IFC, just as the EBRD in Europe has a mandate to support the private sector. And I think at the National Development Bank level, there is a similar, dichotomy where you have some national development banks which are more focused on supporting the private sector. And there, I think the role of the development banks is really to direct that lending where it's most needed for development purposes. So it's to really play that development role and to also, go the step of monitoring the implementation, the results, and so on, which I think the private sector is not equipped to do and is not even, of course, mandated to do. So that's where I think there's a clear role to play, and that can be done quite effectively also through national development banks, provided that they are, convinced and committed to that role.
Okay, let me maybe rephrase the question as I see it. We're discussing about raising the bar of sustainable finance through cooperation between public and public. I mean, this is the multilateral international system vis-a-vis the national system, which is driven mainly by national concerns. We all know that growth, employment is created by private sector. And so the question becomes, to me, where is the priority for a multilateral bank? I mean, is the priority to go direct to private investors, just like I would say IFC would do, or a lot of DFIs would do in the European system? Or is there a responsibility also from the multi to help the local public sector to grow in its lending role and its inspiring role, again, to raise the bar for sustainable finance? Because we don't see private, or I find it difficult to see private sector raising the bar by itself, only on a voluntary basis, just deciding that today they will do better banking or better project just because they like it more or they have a morality that goes with it. I really wonder whether this type of pressure is even legitimate for private sector. I don't know what you think of that. And of course, all participants can put their thoughts and share in the chat or in the question box. Thomas, are you more inspired now with the...
Well, that was kind of what I was trying to think through myself, Régis, like, because there's many different ways that question could be answered. And,
certainly.
And I think more or less I'm in agreement with you that, I mean, let me take as a baseline that I'm not a climate denier, that we have really important, urgent, and significant challenges in terms of transitioning to decarbonized green future. And then we also have really important questions of equity and justice in terms of making sure that societies, marginalized groups, women, racialized communities are not disproportionately disadvantaged in this transition. So for me, in terms of the relationship between what are public funds held in multilateral development banks and public funds held in national development banks, that these should be guided by some form of transparent and accountable public purpose, and moving forward with, as aggressive and as possible green and just transition. So that means, really not focusing on, ensuring profitability or but ensuring on policy. And, let me just take a little bit of I'm Canadian by descent, and we have a new national development bank there, Canada Infrastructure Bank, and it has the wrong mandate. Its mandate is to maximize private investment in infrastructure with no green mandate, no just mandate. It's just about using public money to de-risk and leverage private finance. And I think that's the wrong mandate. And I'm on public record on that. And I'm happy to say that 1 million times a day. I like the CEB mandate. It has an exclusively social mandate, right? But it really is about transparent and accountable public policy and using that to leverage and mobilize public funds and looking where the low-hanging fruit is. We know we need significant municipal regeneration and reconstruction and decarbonization. All right, let's work with cities. Also local regional governments who need to protect public services, public transport. That's a huge way to lower decarbonization. Most public green finance is going to electric vehicles and to charging stations, the individualization of green transport, which is worsening the climate problem, rare earth metals and so on. Sure, it's important. Public transport's a better way. Public water, private finance is not going into that in any substantial way, and we don't want it in public water, right? So another way is that relationship, and the AFD has done research on this as well, between the multilaterals and national development banks in terms of assuring, access to, clean, sustainable, accessible, equitable water. There are really major, large chunks of low-hanging fruit in terms of public infrastructure, municipal infrastructure, and so on, that just needs clear policy. And we can direct a lot of money, a lot of resources, and make significant progress. And this is where it will just push the private sector along. They're going to have to follow or be left out. And public finance should be doing that at the most accessible, most appropriate, longest term, stable financing terms possible. And they can do it. And they do it as a matter of policy. And that is really the challenge we have, is to align that, but also make it transparent and accountable. There's nothing, this is my conceptual argument. There's nothing inherently better or worse of public banks over private banks. It's just that we have, we can make them better by integrating, governance and democracy and accountability and guiding them according to policy rather than, quarterly profit returns, which has no necessary relationship to a green transition or not. And I see some of our colleagues from the Climate Policy Initiative are here as well, and they have really interesting data on this. They traced out in their most recent climate finance policy report that over the last 10 years, there's been something in the range of nearly $5 trillion in traceable climate finance. So 4.8 trillion over the last 10 years. And they're saying more or less 50% has been private finance and 50% public finance. But take into account that the private financial resources are 5 times that of the public resources. The implication being that public finance is by far over, punching above its weight in terms of climate finance. And for the last 3 years, public finance has been in greater quantities than private finance, period. So we just need to make better use of that. Let's not waste our time, talking about how can we, leverage, leveraging billions to trillions. Let's just do it, right?
Okay, well, that's a very, very strong statement, Thomas, because of course the international debate right now is going in the opposite direction, and
I know,
a lot of debates within our institutions, and I'm interested to see how Elif would see that questions. But I know that within our institution at AFD, for instance, one of the key questions today is wouldn't it be more legitimate to use more of our money to leverage private sector funds to go at scale and make sure that the transition is taking place, that we raise the bar through mobilizing more finance or redirecting existing finance into more sustainability than do things by ourselves. So, I mean, what you're raising here is quite an important point. Elif, what's your views on that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting debate because there's been a lot of positive initiatives driven by the private sector. For instance, the whole ESG, environment, social governance criteria and ratings, but at the same time there were also limits. So we also saw the risk of greenwashing and of not that being under a clear framework and regulation. And recently in 2018 the EU adopted its action plan for sustainable finance, where clearly that's what they aim at preventing. So to really have a framework for the private sector also to clearly qualify what's sustainable finance. I mean, of course, they are free to finance whatever they want to finance, but if it has to be qualified as green financing, it has to be under a certain framework. So there's the EU taxonomy in this regard, which really defines the activities that could be financed to ensure that they are sustainable. So in this regard, I think things are moving. So it's a real also positive, I would say, momentum today with the need to mobilize private funds, but at the same time, the potential also for clarifying a number of frameworks. So it could also be interesting the multilateral development level to put in place something a bit similar for the other countries. Yeah, we can't hear you, Régis.
Régis, we cannot hear you.
Sorry, I didn't put my microphone back. No, I was saying that I'm turning to you again for additional questions, just for the audience also, to mention that for the ones that are that understands English well, but that are not so comfortable to write in English, you can write your questions in French without any difficulties. All the people here can read French easily, and Jean-Baptiste will help you with online translation as it will be needed. So Jean-Baptiste, what other question did you select in the chat?
Yes, we do have more questions arriving, and maybe the next one, which is quite interesting as well, is a question from Claire, who is focusing on a very specific type of public development bank that are bilateral development banks, because these institutions are national public development banks, but they do have a very specific mandate. And Claire's question is, according to you, what is the role of these bilateral development banks in the relationship between multilateral development banks and national development banks in general? So over to you.
Okay, who wants to take that?
I can take a first crack at it. Or Elif, I'm happy to pass the baton to you.
I was saying that Régis is from the bilateral.
Maybe Régis, why don't you take a crack at that?
But
okay. I think the role of a bilateral bank today is really in the process of being redefined. I mean, we've been living for the past 70 years, more or less, under the assumption that the world was relatively easy. We were having, the rich country on one side, the poor countries, well, some emerging world, and the role of the bilateral development institutions or banks was to compensate that, provide financing to people who needed them, to grow to a level of GDP that was more or less, or that would be more or less equivalent to the one of the so-called rich countries. And we see that this equation is totally twisted, because we are all in transitions today. I mean, for the rich country, we have a great challenge to keep, our welfare without having such an impact on the environment and on climate, and also have more equilibrium in our social issues. So we really have this challenge, and we see it in the street today in France. For the poor countries, or the poorer countries, LDCs, as we call them, there is also this challenge of what is the adequate growing path that they have to adopt, not to go into the same trap as the one we are sort of taken in, where our development is certainly industrial, is certainly bringing a lot of wealthiness in the short term, but it's not sustainable for the coming 20 to 30 years. So I think the challenge is now a challenge of partnership, much more than a challenge of aid as it used to be. And we have a lot of work to do conceptually to understand what it means in terms of change of attitude vis-a-vis development questions, probably change of financial instruments also, which are not that adequate in most of the time, and also realizing that the fiscal base of a lot of these least developed countries is not really adequate to permit them to really come to the transition if they don't get any additional support. After all, the historical responsibility of climate disruption, of nature disruption, goes along with industrialization and the globalization, to which the main beneficiaries are obviously today what are the richer economies. So I think we are in a revolutionary period in a sense, where we have to really reinvent what a bilateral development bank or development agency should be in the 21st century to be really meaningful in this public policy. I'm sorry, the answer is a bit vague because we don't really have a proper definition as today as we are speaking. And I think at AFD, we're putting a lot of thoughts and inputs in that with the whole team to try to design a strategic plan which would be quite different from the one we had in the past, and which would be oriented towards this question of better partnership, more sustainability, be where you are needed, let private sector do what they aim at or what they are structured for, and do your job as public banking to go into the places where this type of financing would not go otherwise. I mean, does this inspire you, Elif, also being in a multilateral development bank?
Yes, I mean, it's also true that bilateral development institutions are very different, a bit like national development banks. They have different roles as well. So typically in the case of AFD, it's of course focused on international development, the development arm of KfW as well. So for those types of bilateral institutions, I think we function quite similarly, and we even do a lot of co-financing in certain countries. So in that respect, I think they would be more aligned with the more multilateral approach, because they are there to finance outside the country. But then the national development banks, of course, are focused on supporting developments in their own country. So in that respect, I think they would be more positioned with multilateral development banks, as long as they have a clear development mandate.
Thank you. Thomas, a short comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I agree with what's been said and the various types of relationships. I would just say, in terms of the question, the role of bilateral public development banks, I think there can also, be a role there for experimenting and extending forms of inclusive governance that you might find at home in these institutions. I'm thinking something like, the KfW or other banks that have, connections to various sectors of society, and experimenting with those ways in which, in some cases, like, again, say the KfW, quite advanced and progressive green transition policies make its way into the policy of that bank. How can you, and have credibility within the institution, how can you work at a bilateral level to support inclusive development, credible developmental policy, this co-development of metrics that matter, and I think in some ways the national development banks that have bilateral relations have greater, let's say, experience in that regard, and could work with MDBs, which sometimes are more, not present company excluded, but there are forms of multilateral development banks that are known for their more top-down approach, and there's significant work that needs to be done within the multilateral community and bilateral as well, in terms of experimenting with things like how do you gain meaningful, free, prior, informed consent with Indigenous communities? How do you advance meaningful gender metrics with communities? And so on. So I think there's, I don't think multilateral national or bilateral national are inherently better in any ways, but each of these institutions have different forms of expertise and knowledge, and we should draw from the best examples of those to advance what you're talking about, Régis, in terms of rethinking the future of bilateral lending, which is often in collaboration with the multilaterals, and think more inclusively and collaboratively and so on.
Yeah. And if I can add, in terms of expertise, it's true that, our co-financing with bilateral institutions, it's true that they can bring in some expertise from their country which sometimes at the multilateral level we of course can do as well, but sometimes it's interesting to build this relation with a country, and I think typically AFT or KfW are quite strong at doing that. So in that respect, they have an added value, which I think is very positive.
Yeah, but we're talking about raising the bar in terms of sustainability. And so for bilateral institutions like us, our questions to the multi also is, are they actually raising the bar high enough to be also an inspiration and a driver for smaller institutions to go in the same directions? I mean, if big players like the multilateral bank, and I'm thinking of the regional banks in particular, the Inter-American Development Bank, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, yourself, EIB also, are not setting the bar for sustainability. And I would go as far as saying that it should be a new conditionality to access the funds. I mean, or should it be a new conditionality? It will be relatively difficult for smaller bilateral initiatives, to sort of set this type of bar, which is more universal, and as I see it, more legitimate in a multilateral environment. In the bilateral relations, you always have, these questions of what is it that you are imposing to another country? What is your legitimacy to come to Latin America, to Brazil, or to an African country and say, well, if you want to access our financing, that's where the bar is in terms of sustainability. Is always questionable in terms of even political acceptance. Therefore, I would see the multi not doing enough in their responsibilities as of today for raising the bar in terms of criteria of sustainability. And this goes along with some of the questions that we have in the chat in that respect. Does this inspire something additional to you, Elif or Thomas? Are you agreeable with this question?
I mean, the fact that the bar has to be raised, of course, but how to achieve it is another question. I mean, it's not, of course, not straightforward at all. And typically, I mean, and we see that also in our cooperation with national development banks, even the banks themselves, I mean, they are under a framework. So it's really the national framework. So if we talk about SDGs, the first thing is that it has to be embraced at country level. It has to be, within a national strategy for institutions like us to also be able to follow up on it and contribute. So the conditionality is more, I would say, conviction than conditionality, because we need that to be, well framed at the highest level. And I would like to give you maybe, comes to my mind, the example of one of the CB member countries that we recently had showcased in a workshop, which is Finland, which has an impressive track record because they really have both a top-down and bottom-up approach for SDGs, and it's really it's in their strategies at all levels. I mean, from the government level to subnational, but also private sector. It's followed by the civil society. They monitor it. They even evaluate it independently every 4 years. And it's true that, I mean, it's maybe a kind of a dream example, but it exists, and it's important to promote those examples because that ownership at country level is very important.
If I could jump on that a little bit to agree, I think this question of ownership at the country or subnational level in the community, ownership at the community level is really important, and this is where I think really the multilaterals and national banks really do need to raise the bar significantly, not simply on moral and normative grounds of gaining consent of communities, which is important, but also just a shout out to research recent book on development banks and Amazon by Ray and Gallagher and Lee, I believe, a 2020 book, where they document the role of development banks in the Amazon and make the simple but important finding that where there's conflict in development programs, where there's not consent gained by the financiers in terms of infrastructure programs and communities, then those programs tend to fail, those projects tend to fail, and therefore are inefficient. So if you want to advance green and just transitions at the pace and scale and on the terms appropriate, you need to have consent and community buy-in. And that form of, and linking to the recommendations of the paper, developing co-developed metrics of success, not having a list of 100, but what are 5 agreements on what a project would be successful, what it would mean to be successful, agreed to by the communities, by which everyone can then line up behind and work towards. And yeah, as a form of in a sense, conditionality, but sorry, Elif, I liked your word better. It's about credibility and consent, I guess, but I can't remember, you put it in a better term.
Thank you very much. So Jean-Baptiste, I'm turning again to you for taking another question from the audience.
Yes, so looking at the votes in the question box, we have a question from Michael, who is recalling that the green and sustainable transitions also yield winners and losers, and his question relates to the new finance opportunities that may emerge from the green transition, and their matching with social requirements and maybe the protection of the so-called losers. And maybe to what extent does the cooperation between multilateral development banks and national development banks can also match these social requirements?
Elif, I guess that's an ideal question for you, huh?
Yes, I mean, not ideal, but very difficult to assess because, as I was mentioning, I mean, there is this EU taxonomy for green sustainable investments, which I think sets a very positive framework for going forward in the right direction towards also Paris alignment. But for the social window, I think the EU is working also on a social taxonomy, but it's been a bit delayed. But we also are very much interested in it as a social development bank. It's true that the SDGs themselves have a number of trade-offs between environmental also and social requirements, and we see that also in our own financing. I mean, when we are too focused on employment, we might also sometimes disregard some environmental aspects and so on. So it's true that they really have to be looked at together, and that's also why, for instance, at CB, all our guidelines are environmental and social safeguards and so on. So we really look at them together, but that's very important indeed.
Thomas, you want to?
No, I don't think I have
we...
anything to add on that. Just to support what Elif said, and
I think what is getting clear in the recent years is that there is no such thing as a climate question independently of the biodiversity question, independently of inequalities, independently of gender, independently of social concerns. I mean, all those are parameters of the same equation. And we see in France that if we don't treat them in parallel, we go nowhere, because people are not ready to do. I mean, people are now conscious of the importance of the challenge, but they're not eager to make efforts if they don't have the deep feeling that this is done in perfect equality and fairness between the various levels of revenues of the society. And this conscience is not there today. So we as development banks, we are trying to catch up financing projects in contexts where it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince people that green only or climate only will bring a solution. And I think this is again getting a global challenge. I mean, the phenomenon is taking place almost everywhere as we see it, and even in so-called least developed countries, where we see some rejections that were not there in the past, on the assumption that by definition money coming to the country is good or will have a positive effect on local development. So that's how, Michael, I would put the answer, that there is no other way for success today and for the green transition than to incorporate the social question in bold in all the policies that are being developed. Jean-Baptiste,
Can I just add to
yes.
that, Régis? I know you might have another question, but because I think it's important to point out that I think what you just said, the interconnection between the green transition and the social elements, socio-economic and green, are interlinked, and we have to bring them all together. You know, just to raise it again, I think this is the challenge of the World Bank strategy right now, that it cannot do that in the strategy of maximizing private finance for development, because and it's not a judgment or anything. It's simply, if the priority is to ensure and generate maximizing returns, then those other things are secondary by definition. And so that's the question: should public money be geared towards that? Is that the right strategy for a green and just transition? And my answer is no. And I think there are structural problems with that approach. And we need to think about that seriously.
Thank you, Thomas. Jean-Baptiste, we have 8 minutes left for the discussion, so I'm afraid you will need to be selective in the question.
Yes.
Not that all of them are not interesting, but let's see what you have in your box.
Yes, and in fact, I can synthesize two questions together that are quite related. The first one is a question from Bianca, who is asking, to what extent do you, Elif, Thomas, and Régis, suspect the appetite of PDBs for the shift in multilateral development banks towards the global public goods, just like climate? And Said was also interested to know more about the climate finance agenda with respect to the multilateral development bank reform, and maybe beyond. Is climate the only topic for this multilateral development bank reform?
Who wants to go first? I go? Okay. No, I see that coming very strongly, really. I mean, we have a lot of meetings thanks to the coalition Finance in Common that we organize every year to try to gather development banks together. And we don't meet any CEOs today, any CFO, anybody from a development bank, at least, and even I would say from private finance, that is not having a concern on what is going to happen to my balance sheet. I mean, everybody is realizing the question is serious now. There is very little doubt less about that. A lot are behaving like if they are clandestine, they say, well, I'm small, I have no impact, or it's too difficult for me, or etc. So we see this kind of attitude, but it's not long lasting. I mean, it's the demand is there. And even I would say the demand is there to generate more demand from customers that is sustainable. I mean, we also have a challenge as banks. We have customers coming, and we see that at AFD saying, I would like to do good. Help me. What is the recipe? Because that's how I was doing my business. And so if it's not sustainable, help me with the diagnosis and the how to do it better. And so to answer Bianca and others, I think the future is going to be strong in that. I also saw that Damien Barshish of IDRI is with us and asked and put a link to the very interesting paper that IDRI did on the question of alignment of banks. I mean, how do you consider at what level of demand should you have on the financing to consider that it's really a green financing or it's a sustainable financing? And we see think tanks, academics. We also have a very interesting study from Natixis, ordered by IDFC. I mean, a lot is coming on that, and we see it internally at AFD also, that this is really the demand from general management, from our director general, and for our strategic plans. So I think we are on this way, and it's very encouraging, in fact. I finish here. I don't know if Thomas, Ellis, you want to? I'm sure you want to add something to that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can say, so I mean, I fully agree with what you just said. And for instance, at CB, we issued recently, the board adopted the CB's new strategic framework, 23-27, and it's really clearly underlined. Climate is underlined as a cross-cutting issue because we're not a climate finance-oriented bank, but we really underline the social consequences also of climate change and incorporate it also at every level of our internal functioning, but also the CB lending through also work on Paris alignment, also in coordination with other multilateral development banks. So I think the climate finance is something that's very important. But again, I think there will be also more specialized channels of lending. I mean, we know the EIB is now the Climate Bank of Europe. So I think there will be also an important coordination to be made so that the channels are really clarified and avoid overlapping. Yeah.
Thank you, Elif. Well, I think we're getting...
I'm going to interrupt, Régis, because there's one thing I do want to say before we leave. And I would just add to that in terms of the appetite. I think it's important to recognize that there are a lot of really wonderful people working in public banks, and they've long, had the public purpose in mind. But it's really been constrained by 30 years of saying public banks are corrupt, they should be privatized and so on. Now is the time really to reclaim that and to say that there is a role and a purpose and an importance to using public banks and public finance, reasonably and accountably and transparently, and to enable these institutions to do that, and not as as a second best to private banks, but as the green and just gold standard of this. And it's really a very important message, I think, that we have to recognize the role that they played for decades in some cases.
Well, Thomas, I think that would make a nice conclusion for the discussion of today, as we only have 1 minute to go. Of course, I would like to thank both of you, thank the audience, and maybe give this last minute to Jean-Baptiste to say a few words on this very important international event on public development banks that is coming in Colombia next year, Jean-Baptiste?
Yes, thank you, Régis. So indeed, 2023 is a very important year for public development banks and the PDB ecosystem, with the upcoming summit, which will take place in Paris in June. We're also at the crossroad with respect to the 2030 agenda. So we'll have this SDG summit at the end of the year. But I would also like to mention in September the Finance in Common Summit, which will gather all public development banks in Colombia, in Cartagena to be precise, from the 4th to the 6th of September. And I think what we've seen today is that research is a key element of the debate on the role and activities of public development banks within the global financial architecture. And during the next Finance in Common Summit, the objective will be to gather together both practitioners and also researchers to discuss on various topics such as SMEs and financial inclusion, climate, biodiversity, and of course the PDB institutional agenda. So stay tuned. We will share more information before September, and we'll also be pleased to continue this debate within this other arena. Thank you very much.
Jean-Baptiste. Well, all our apologies to André, Marc, Léonore, Pierre, Mohamed, for not having able to provide them direct answers to their questions. I hope still that in answering to others, we've been touching also some of the points that were concerned to them. So that was a very motivating and interesting research conversation. Thank you very much, Elif. Thank you very much, Thomas, for having been with us this beginning of afternoon, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thanks for everyone for attending.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.